the title is well established. I don't want to go through my outline roughly. I want to first just explain what I think by uncritical cybernetics, and then come to the real issue that I think we have to address. Um, Now, let me see. The first thing is, I mean, we all know, I hope we know basically what cybernetics is, or what it was at the time, particularly of Wiener, and it is still practiced. Namely, usually it starts with some sort of a belief in the universality of mathematical kind of conceptions, is translated into algorithms, and then instantiated and applied into some sort of a computer system, and this interacts with users, and it does certain things. Now, Norbert Wiener at that time had the idea that cybernetics will increase the freedom of individuals, will create equality, and create community, and with one little qualification, namely that a social system should not unnecessarily infringe on individual freedom. So this is the kind of promises or hopes that he had. Now, the Macy Foundation meetings enthusiastically embraced that. By that I mean they looked for applications for what that, and they found amazing things. But it is limited criticality. I mean, being enthusiastic is one thing, being concerned with other things is another. So I think I like to start with saying what happened instead of these promises. And so when one looks a little bit at the social history, the most primitive kind of cybernetic systems were controllable feedback mechanisms, like the thermostat, or the toilet that fills itself up and you don't need to have to put water each time after you used it, and or safety devices in cars. The interesting part is that these systems are structurally closed. That means you, as user, you can't have access to it. But on the larger side, on the producer does have access to it, and can repair it and install it, etc. So these are not very problematic type of systems. But then came, I think, the major digitalization of cognitive abilities, and we live with the internet, we live on computers, social media, and they all extend our cognitive abilities. But on the other side, the unanticipated consequences is the huge technical corporations that developed, that they thrive on selling user data for corporations that want to exploit the users that in fact are taking advantage of the digitalization. The next kind of stage, and it is not all that historical, it comes in parallel in part, but the practice of replacing routine occupation by robots. That sounds, as a robots, it sounds maybe too much as in the image of human beings, but think about the teller machine. A teller machine replaces actually a bank teller. The great advantage is you can use it for 24 hours, and you don't have to smile or do other type of things, but it reduces actually that what the bank teller does to what is kind of automatic, what is repetitive, what is universal. And for the corporations, for the banks, for example, it means that they can save human labor. And I think that the speeding up and growing an institution, that is the consequence of replacing routine occupations by cybernetic systems. And this goes further, namely to kind of automating bureaucratic practices. Now, by that I mean, for example, well, think about when you want to deal with your city government, and you have to answer questions to get by telephone to an answer. Then you do you want to have this, that, and the other? So you go to a sequence of questions and then usually, or at least I don't often get to the answer that I want. In fact, I'm giving it turned in a circle. The point is that these are automatic institutions that no longer deal with with unique or specialized individual users. Now, this allows, I think, big institutions to become basically automated. Think about the IRS, the tax authority in the United States. Well, you have forms, everyone has the same, you fill it out, but for unusual circumstances, they're not provided. And we know there are algorithms that check what your previous income was, what your current income was, compared with what banks tell them. So that is pretty much automated. And we as human beings, we cannot do very much. We cannot go and say we don't like this form. So, and then there are a lot of adaptive or learning organizations. I'm not even so sure if learning is the right word, but people talk about machine learning. The point is that there are algorithms that adjust to the nature of the data on which they apply and give advice or whatever. Now that is, for example, a New Jersey judge who had to put a supposedly exceptional prisoner on probation. Everyone agreed he is no problem, etc., etc. And so and then came an algorithm and said, no, he's a high risk. And then the judge says, on what basis? Tell me the data. And then the person that represented it said, it's all data from the last 10 years of all releases of prisoners. Well, a judge can't really go through all of these data. Then he asked, now what is the algorithm? How is it being computed? And this is protected by a copyright, and you can't reveal it. So now this is a case where you have big statistics that nobody can really understand in detail. You have an algorithm that nobody knows, and you're asked as human being to comply or not. Now the judge has the choice, of course, to say to hell with it, and I'm making my own judgment. But this is very risky, because if that person would indeed become a criminal again, then he, the judge, will be blamed for it. So the safest way is, of course, to comply with the algorithm, take this as the authority to make decisions of that nature. And then we have completely autonomous systems, like how the electric grid is regulated in the United States. And we don't know any of that. We have no access to it. There's no input. We know it only when they fail. And there are, for example, right now in Texas, that was a good case where it failed in major ways. And then we knew that there are systems behind that regulate, but we have no clue of what they are. So there is a systematic kind of degradation of human involvement. And I think that from a cybernetic point of view, there are actually basically two kinds of feedbacks driving this development. On the one side is the unintended externalities of cybernetics. They facilitate the runaway, increasingly autonomous algorithmization of institutions. On the other hand, while indeed expanding the range of individual connections to other people, services, information, etc., there is a deviation reducing negative feedback that increases the cybernetic technological dependence and reduces systematically or minimizes systematically human agency. Now, graphically, you can see it like this. These are the headlines that I mentioned earlier. The uncritical acceptance of the algorithms constrain or reduce individual agency, human agency, as one comes from very simple tools like hammers and screwdrivers to automatic systems. And that is related to the tremendous uncontrolled growth of social institutions which rely on massive uses of cybernetic technologies. Now, as I said, there is, of course, for individuals, there is a benefit, for example, using digital devices by expanding their influence or their connection to others. But there is, at the same time, also an increasing reliance or complicity with the nature of the systems. Now, I know I have very little time, but I wanted to say something about human agency. I don't mean it in this very general sense, having freedom. That it doesn't really mean very much. And I'm relying here on C. Wright Mills' account of agency. That means an agent. He actually studied the American power elite, and he went from board meetings, etc., and asked himself, now, how is power exerted? And his answer was simply that people make proposals and justify them, and they are giving accounts of why they are good, and then inform other people to comply with it. And so you either make a proposal in anticipation of being held accountable, you give accounts, or you are asked by people that have to comply with it, why do you do this, explain, etc., etc. And this is much more general. The point is that agency, I mean, doing things in itself is meaningless unless there are accounts given that explain for why something is being done. And that goes in Wittgenstein's direction. Namely, he said always the meaning of assertions is the responses they elicit. That means what one says, it doesn't mean anything, but what is said, what is made of it, that's where the meanings come, and that is where interactions come to be and real. And I don't want to get to all of these kind of accounts through this, but just to say, one can claim agency by saying how well my proposed plan is. One can admit agency by saying, I'm sorry, I did it, but one can also deny agency by saying there is no reason for me to be blamed for it. And one can scapegoating agency by saying someone else did it, and or one can simply deny one's ability to have choices. And I mean, I don't want, I hate to read this all, but claiming to be powerless or disabled or uninformed, that these are typical examples where one says I'm unable, and I'm questioning that a little bit. So, and I just want to mention John Schotter, who added basically reflexivity to this Mills conception by saying, we can hardly communicate without reflectively anticipating being held accountable for what we do. In fact, when we talk, then one talks always in the anticipation that someone might not misunderstand it or ask me questions, and that is always implicit. But I don't want to get too deep into this, but in stark contrast, and that is perhaps important, algorithms cannot account for what they do, and nor can they tell where they're inserted. Technologies, they may move in numerous ways by designers' intentions, but they cannot say why they do what they do. So technologies can afford or limit human actions, but not force users to adopt their conceptions or their nature. They are not no agents. Now, and I think biological systems that are supposed to be structurally determined, they can also do amazing things, but they cannot say why they do what they do. So in that sense, there are no agents comparable with human agencies. And I would say further, social organizations have no voice either. Now that is, I know that is controversial, but the controversial lies only in the use of language. Namely, we can say, the White House says, but the White House doesn't have a voice. There's always someone who speaks in the name of the administration or in the name of other people. So members of organizations can talk for themselves with each other, speak about absent others, and so. But it's always individuals who speak, and the actions of a social organization is the result actually of a coordination of numerous individual actions. So what, in my opinion, what explains this peculiar dual development of cybernetics, on the one side, the individual, on the other side, the uncontrolled growth, has to do, I think, with uncritical cyberneticians enjoy the convenient role of being detached observers. Now, this is not just cyberneticians. Many scientists see themselves as observers, describing their observations in terms they like, as general as possible, maybe mathematically, etc., etc. And it doesn't really matter how that relates to the internal nature of the system. Using machine or biological metaphors, they're all free to do this, but they all imply that the theories they develop are superior to what is going on inside the system, which is, of course, particularly problematic when it really was a social system. The second point of why that this development is taking place is that the social consequences of technologies are externalities, are inaccessible to those who design it. A computer programmer can translate a certain kind of formal requirement into code, and once it is in code, there's no way of no capability to see what are the consequences of that. So, and then I think mathematical or biological metaphors, which are often used to describe complex systems, but I think they distract from understanding the use of other discourses that are involved in social systems. And the next thing is that one cannot, the cybernetic technology may adapt in various ways, but they cannot escape the confines of their designs. One can speak of intelligence, but they are not. They are confined by what they're designed for. So, and I think to me, I think the most important part is the routine attribution of agency to cybernetic technologies, or if you want other objects in nature, they forces their users into submission to the social organizations that thrive on employing such technologies, and who then can take advantage of and implicitly exercising domination, oppression, and human agencies to make them undesirable. So I think, to me, much of it has to do with the language that implies that one applies on one's own doing. Now, critical cybernetics, I think, cannot be practiced without language. You can't observe criticality. You can assert being critical of something, or one can consider alternatives, but in language. One cannot observe the alternatives only once they are implemented in some form. So I think that this is important to me. Critical cybernetics is not in machines rather than in the practice of language. So now, to me, there are two key influences, one can say. Pili mentioned already Margaret Mead's 1967 talk. Now, she was an anthropologist. She was participating in the Macy Foundation conferences, and she suggested to cyberneticians to redirect their attention not to the machines they built so well, but to the language they were using. Now, by language, she meant actually, I don't know, I suspect she meant the kind of experiences she had at the Macy's Foundation conference. It means the kind of leisurely conversations through which ideas emerge. And so she said, this is what cybernetics should be focusing on. And the second one, she said, you have to look at the social consequences. In 1967, the social consequences are far different from what we're experiencing now, and she focused actually on the automatic weapons that both Russia and the United States were developing, and they were designed to trigger automatically. And she rightly said that that is very dangerous if one leaves the control of human beings out. So I think to change from designing machines rather than to describe how one comes to these conceptions, that I think is her main thing. Now, Ashby had, I think, many faces, but one interesting thing is he defined cybernetics not as circular causal mechanisms. He defined cybernetics as a study of the dynamics, behavior of all systems, whether they are built, whether they exist in nature, or whether they are constituted by members of social systems, or imagined that are secondary to the very study. So he considered, I mean, this is, I can argue a little bit. In my interpretation, he said that he said, in fact, literally, cybernetics is to the real world like geometry is to the ground. Now that to me means also cybernetics is a discourse that opens possibilities which may not be realized. So, and I think I extend that, or I use both of them to say to me, and I'll read it to you. Critical cybernetics is an interdisciplinary and conversational discourse that enables the reflexive examination of the history, dynamics, future consequences of all conceivable systems, especially in social systems that its human constituencies take for granted. I mean, we live with so many things and nobody asks a question that. And the point is actually critical cybernetics has to question what everyone takes for granted or doesn't dare to question or is unable to imagine. So I think to me, critical cybernetics has to investigate something that may not be, that not everyone may be aware of, and that people may not dare to question. Also, that is, I think, to me, the one of the key feature of critical cybernetics. But there are a few others that needs to be mentioned. One is the notion of social system and how that relates. Now, to me, a social system is actually constituted by human beings that communicate with each other, maybe technologically mediated, but it is people that use language that define a social system, define their role in it, etc., etc. I should also like to say against those who constantly use biological metaphors for understanding social systems may be intermittently dormant. Like, for example, the university, well, they have courses maybe starting at 8 o'clock in the morning, ending maybe 10 o'clock in the evening, but then they're dead. Everyone is doing other things. Their members may travel across their boundaries freely, be members of different organizations at different times. And so social systems may be reconstituted by their members routinely by the clock, or in response to particular situations, like when there's a war, then suddenly everyone is drafted and becomes a soldier. And these social systems also evolve in response to environmental challenges or in response to other kinds of social organization challenging it. And to me, most important, they may respond to criticism. So I think this to me, I think is kind of a nutshell, but I would say we can be fixed for a moment on this notion of social systems. And I think critical theorists, they need to participate and understand, creatively communicate in view of the social consequences, that their social theories in view of their consequences. So I think there is a difference between, let's say, a general abstract theory that's an outside observer, detached observer creates, and one that has potential consequences. And I would say that the social theories are participating in the constitution of social systems. That means the work that a critical theorist should do is being fed back into the system. Now, it doesn't mean that critical theorists control a system. There are numerous ways in which social theories are affected, are effective. They should be judged not by what they're true or false, but what they enable or disable. And that these are another criteria which has nothing to do with truth or false. Although those who want to apply it, they might well use truth criteria. But when adopted, they become self-reifying. That means they create a reality they state. By when they are opposed, they become self-invalidating, and they may be totally irrelevant to anyone but the theorists. And they make also that is perhaps what is to this talk very important. They encourage or confine the agency of participants in social systems. I just want to point out that, for example, if one develops a theory in mathematical terms and then brings it back into the social system, then one either finds that people are willing to conform to their presuppositions, or it will not be effective.
Klaus,
So now,
that was your 5-minute warning.
okay, I will be short. Okay, now, and I would say critical cybernetics is critical insofar as it fearlessly examines possibilities of particularly of unbearable constraints of their agency, oppressions and pathologies. And it results, it's not true or false, but it is socially responsive. And the critical part is that the dialogical or conversational nature of its investigation invites all stakeholders, not just cyberneticians, but also those who are affected. And when these stakeholders have a language that doesn't allow them to see their own confinement, I think the critical cyberneticians are required to interject new language that enables them to see themselves, to make them aware of their language, and able to participate in the critical examination. So, and there are, I think, there are 5 projects that I think that critical cybernetics can engage in, and you too. First of all, I think we have to develop a style of or method of inquiry that is not, let's say, statistical, or can be statistical, but it's collaborative, it is conversational in nature, and each participant needs to be accountable to each other to participate. The second part is to actively deny the common attribution of or misattribution of agencies or intentions of authorities, powers, or superior intelligence to technologies. I mean, once you do that, then you submit already to that. If you say that this is an artificial intelligence, there must be more superior than me, then you yield. The third one is to find ways to get to those who develop the technologies, to hold them accountable. That's more difficult because most of the cybernetic technologies are the result of big corporations having developed over history with big teams, develop them. But at each moment, there are people that work on the improvement of a particular system. And these people have to know somehow what they are doing, and one has to hold them accountable for. The fourth is to demand transparency for cybernetic systems which are employed in the social domain. In New Jersey, there are several communities, they say, as a city, we will not accept any algorithm that is not transparent, that is not examinable from everyone else. But the flip side of that is, of course, we have to have the ability to examine that, and not everyone can read code, and it is not necessary to read code, but there has to be increased competence, educational competence in examining the algorithms that determine everyone's life. So, and then the fifth one, and that is what I said from the beginning, I think, is to raise awareness of the users of cybernetic systems about their own role in constituting the reality of that systems. I mean, there is no society without people. People need to participate, need to yield, or need to talk about what they're doing. So for me, critical cybernetics have to introduce concepts, metaphors, narratives that enable both individuals to liberate themselves from troublesome relationship to technology, and also enable them to critically examine what critical cybernetics does. So that is what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you. And there have been quite a few questions going on in the series. So I will, there are a lot of them to do with whether it's cybernetics is second order cybernetics or critical cybernetics. What does critical mean to them, to various people? So I've got a speaking order right now that will summarize some of these questions. Paulo de Costa, then Lou, no, I'll leave Lou for third, then Cliff Jocelyn, and then Lou and Huda. And then I'll go for further questions as they come. So Paulo, you had a couple of questions. Could you iterate them for Klaus, please?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I can hear me, but I can't see. Oh, yes, I can. I was just looking for my questions. I think I typed 3.
Pick the most important ones.
I think so, yeah. Well, I think there are 2 that are important for me, at least. One is, what is your concept of criticality? And the second one is critical cybernetics a reflection on the use and on the fruits and externalities of the use of cybernetics?
Well, the use of cybernetics, I would say the use of cybernetic systems, machines, computers, that is where it is. And indeed, that is being used by human beings. And that's the kind of the issue that I am facing. And when I say, when you asked about criticality, I think if one describes artificial intelligence as being superior to human intelligence, then the implications is that you have to yield to whatever a computer is doing. Recently, I was in a supermarket, and I was uncertain as to how I was built. I asked the person, and she said, "The computer says so." Well, there is no discussion. One cannot hold the computers accountable for, because you attribute authority to something that has no agency whatsoever. So that is I mean, I'm not talking about cybernetics as a discipline. I'm talking about what the discipline should do.
But is it the discipline that should do this, or the population in general? Should the population be basically educated in media literacy?
The discipline doesn't do anything. Just like I said, the social organizations have no voice. Cybernetics has no voice. But people that speak in the name of cybernetics, they can say something. And so I think, yes, indeed, people that use cybernetics, they ought to be held accountable for what they do, including if they scapegoat and saying, well, cybernetics tells me so, that's the reason why I'm doing it. That is scapegoating, and that is denying their own agency.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I understand better. My first impression to your idea of critical cybernetics was that it was defining something in cybernetics that would be uncritical. But I think I understand. It's more about the fighting the uncritical use of cybernetics,
yes,
if I'm not mistaken. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's me done.
The next one I had in line was really quite a short question from Cliff Jocelyn, comparing critical and uncritical.
Thank you. I would actually go to my second question probably at this point. So the kind of reflectivity and responsibility that you're describing, of course, can be brought to bear to many areas of human endeavor. I'm like chemical engineering or agriculture or anything else. Could you reflect on what is special or unique about cybernetics in this context? Or are you saying that cybernetics is special and unique in this context?
Well, I would say cybernetics is special. And there I refer to, if you want, Ross Ashby, who always said that cybernetics has its own foundations, which is not comparable with other disciplines. And I could also talk about the other kinds of critical theories. In fact, I have a slide that I abandoned. I could put it up. There are numerous critical approaches, critical theories. There's Marxian critical theory. He poses basically one society and criticizes another. Or Habermas had the idea of open, free discussion in the public. That's all fine, but I think one should not impose one theory over another. One should allow people to participate, and that's I think the strength of critical cybernetics, not to celebrate, let's say, mathematics or biological metaphors, but rather letting people participate to discuss their own affairs.
I guess what I'm saying is that the ethics of AI, for example, is a very major topic currently in many areas. Our lab does work in that area as well. I'm just wondering if the cybernetic perspective proper, distinct from IT or AI, can lend something to the.
Well, I think what I think is very unique in cybernetics. I mean, the idea of conversation. If you have conversation, there are numerous feedbacks. You say something, someone responds. There is a circle, and this goes on. And to me, I think conversations is probably the most efficient evolutionary process that exists. That means, whereas in species that takes generations before one finds that a mutation, it turns out to be not functional, in conversations that is done immediately. So that is a very creative process which requires precisely the practices of circular kind of conversation. And that is very basic to cybernetics.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, there was a fair bit of discussion of second order cybernetics versus cybernetics. And I'm going to ask Lou to be the spokesperson for that, as he had some interesting further thoughts that struck me as useful to bring up.
It's me.
Lou Kaufman.
Lou Kaufman.
Well, one question that I wanted to ask you was, there's a kind of linguistic technology. It's an old one, but it's become very prominent lately. Linguistic propaganda technology of transforming truths, transforming lies into alternate truths. Mm-hmm. And I wondered how you would comment on that from your point of view.
Well, I think, well, let me say, fundamentally, I think that shows that language is not just neutral. Language is not just representative of reality, but language does things. And I think that is the whole problem of the internet, Facebook, etc., that people can put anything on the net, and as long as other people reproduce it and send it off. And that creates irresponsible type of narratives that in the end prove wrong. In conversations, one is individually held accountable for what one says. And I think there the issues of truth or honesty or positive intentions, etc., enter. I'm not saying that truth is to be abundant, but I'm saying that one has to be careful not to ignore it completely. To me, the uncritical type of approaches are that of external observers that simply say, I observe, I describe, I have the theories, they are better than what people are that are observed. And that is the representational notion of truth. And it is verifiable, if you want, by collecting data, but it is not the way people think. Now, let me just give you one example of tests for competence or tests. Well, they are usually vocabulary tests. And that one asks people, do you know this? What is the definition? And so multiple choice questions. And when someone is very good in language, then he passes this and he maybe gets a job. But this doesn't say anything about how that person could learn, could adjust to become part of a larger system and make contributions. That is, for example, one way of making differentiating between poorer educated people and more sophisticated educated people. But it doesn't say anything about what people can do. Now, I'm not so sure if that answers fully your questions. I do think one has to be careful in what one says. One has to be accountable. And to me, one of the biggest problems of Facebook, etc., is that what one can communicate is almost anonymous. Everyone can say everything, and that not being able to be held accountable is one of the biggest problems of Facebook.
Thank you.
Sorry, I got myself on mute in between here. Huda, you had a very interesting question about epistemology and ontology. Would you like to follow through with that?
Yes, thank you, Pune. Thank you very much, Klaus, for the presentation. It was quite informative. I think that my question relates to the previous comments about second-order cybernetics. And to me, the conversation raises the constant tension between first and second order cybernetics, as well as the tension between a view of hard systems and soft systems. And this is a point of, do we see systems as ontologies? Like when you spoke about social systems, there is an assumption that this system is something out there that we all see the same way. Whereas actually we all have our worldviews and our traditions of understanding. We have our cultures and specific educations and specific biologies, all what makes us see a specific situation, and we will bring forth what I will call my system and what you will call your system, even if we see the same reality. So my question here is, would you see a relationship between what you would call critical cybernetics and soft systems methodologies? And I'm thinking about lineages of Peter Checkland and lineages also of Sir Jeffrey Vickers regarding appreciative systems. Because when we come to human systems, human activities, there we fall into the trap of applying first order cybernetics, whereas the problematic or the situation is more wicked than a machine. So I think what you were saying when you were highlighting that we are external, we see that what I say about the system is right corresponds to this negation of other views. So my question is, how do you situate, yes, so how would you situate your point about critical cybernetics with soft systems methodologies where stakeholders with diverse worldviews are all considered, and there is an accommodation of worldview about what to do in a problematic situation? So,
well, I think the slides that I just put up suggest, in fact, that I don't think that critical cyberneticians can be taken out of the social system of which they are a part. It's, to me, social systems are, just like you say, constituted by many people, have many views of their society and interact based on that. And in some sense, a critical cybernetician can be part of it. Now, and in fact, I would contrast that with the traditional theorist of biology and sociology, who always takes the position of an outsider. And here, in this case, means that, first of all, that any critical theorist needs to understand the language that is being spoken within the social system in which they want to have some influence. They cannot control it. They cannot say what is to be done, but they can interject or introduce certain kinds of ideas, and they may in fact work out or not. the point is actually, I do respect different in social systems, different views, and that has to be seen. And I think the critical cybernetics is just one other, and we can also not be a universal type of theorists. We can work on small things, and that's the reason why these 5 projects that I ended up with, they deal with really how to maybe avoid attributing agency and then submitting to them. And so that these are very small kind of projects that one can engage in, but they all respect other people's view. And it's that kind of, I mean, you mentioned all kinds of things, soft systems, hard systems. One could say that critical cybernetics is part of a soft system insofar as it is based on language. To me, it's more important not that they're hard or soft, but whether language is a constitutive part of the system one explores. And for critical cybernetics, that is the case. And it has to be, because in order to communicate with other people, you have to, in some sense, embrace the language of the social systems that one attends to.
Very good. Thank you. James? Are you there?
Yes, sorry, hi. Yeah, what I was saying in the chat, Klaus, is that if feedback and quality feedback is removed from the system, and I'm taking it that what you're saying is that the systems are removing the ability to be visible, i.e. the agency behind them is being removed, i.e. who is doing it is being removed, and therefore people are not, those systems aren't gaining feedback. Are they actually cybernetic systems? Because cybernetics is based on feedback, if I understand that correctly.
Well, that is not the only thing that is, of course, very critical. Yes, you're right. But there are different kinds of feedbacks. There's the one that when you interact with your computer, you interact, and you get constantly feedback going back and forth. But there's the other thing that you talk with other people about how to use the machine, on how you conceptualize the machine, and that's a different level of feedback. And this is on that level, I think critical cybernetics has something to contribute. And I am just I am just very appalled sometimes by the ease with which people submit to the authority of hard systems, if you want. Like, for example, artificial intelligence is a myth. I mean, to me, I have not seen an artificial intelligence that is not merely expanding certain cognitive ability to where we don't normally reach, like searching for millions of documents within seconds. It's amazing, but it is not extending the intelligence of human beings, particularly not creating anything new.
I was just wondering, though, if as cyberneticians or whatever it is we are, is whether we could hold them to account by basically saying they're not doing cybernetics because they're not allowing sufficient feedback from the system, so the system can evolve and adapt to how it's needed.
Well, I don't know what you mean by feedback from the system. And
well, from individuals in the system, people are part of the system, and you get it with cars now. You used to be able to fix a car. You can't fix a car now because the whole processes are made so they're impenetrable to an individual. Yes. And there seems to be a parallel in what you're saying to just the normal car nowadays.
Yeah. But now a car is not a good example because there is a car mechanic who knows, in fact, more than you do, and then you trust him. And there may be good reason for him because he has better education experiences. But that's different from attributing agency to a machine, to a device, and then yield to it.
But my agency in terms of being able to fix my car has been removed by the people that have designed the car, that have made it that I cannot any longer interact with that car.
Yes, you can. That's right. But you can also not buy the car, and you can use some other kind of device. You can, for example, be on Zoom.
So they're enforcing their power on me to go and buy a bicycle instead. So.
Well, yeah, you can say. But the point is actually we are not automatically, I mean, there are always good reasons for delegating your agency to something else. Like I was saying with the thermostat, I don't want to go every 5 minutes and change the setting of, or put coals in the oven. I'm very happy to have a thermostat that I delegate the agency to. That's fine. But I think the delegation by not understanding what one delegates it to, that becomes difficult. And particularly when we now face huge administrations that are basically completely algorithmized and force us to a behavior that simply is demanded by the algorithms on which they are run.
I totally agree with you, by the way. Just
Yeah, and I think that's why we have to be careful not to yield, at least be aware of when we yield and when we don't. So I think this is one of the things that I didn't put up my comparison to other kind of critical theory. I don't think I want to impose one ethics on everyone, or one theory saying this is it and everyone else is to be discarded. But what I would like to see is that one interacts with people, that one listens to people and enlightens people to be capable of understanding their own situation, their own life.
There are lots of interesting questions still remaining, but there seems to be a popular vote for Sue to address her academic language question to Klaus. And then I think we're coming close to the end of our time too, unfortunately. Or are we?
But go ahead.
Yeah.
I don't hear you. You are not. You are
there we go.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this topic and conversation. And yes, I've been hungry for, you know, these same ideas. And I'm also hungry for the need to say this in language that a general population can understand, and a language that can be understood across disciplines. And so my first attempt has been just a paper, human. I put the paper in the chat because I was a high school teacher for 20 years. And so I was very used to, you know, making language very simple. And so I think it's necessary for all of us to find ways to say what you're saying in ways that everybody can understand, not just us cyberneticians.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I think that's the difference between, let's say, an external observer who is certainly pleased to have a general theory that he can share with his buddies, but is not concerned with what this does.
Yes. So I'm finding that cybernetic systems, mechanical cybernetic systems are control systems, but cybernetic systems in human systems should be support systems so that they support empowering people rather than,
yes.
And sometimes they oppress.
Yes, that's right. And then, but I think most people don't see the oppression.
Yes.
They say, well, okay, you know, that is the machine, and I have to be like an aunt in order to, or an operator or a robot in order to do it. And I'm seeing so many examples, like the extreme example. If I see a kind of on television a celebration of a military stuff, and all these people that walk in goose steps, they are not machines, they are robots. And recently I was actually at a laundry, and there was an Asian woman that operates everything that comes out of the machine, and she was so automatic that that is not really, there's no agency. She had to learn what the machine demanded and did it.
Yes.
And I think it's very important, being a teacher, then of course you know that language is what transmits any influence and so. And I think I'm also a professor, and so what I'm saying here is part of my teaching. I'm teaching a course in which I'm very critical about the language that people, social scientists, use in order to describe their findings.
Yes, yes. But, and even in between disciplines, I mean, from one discipline to the next, among specialists, we have a hard time understanding each other. So we really have to use a have to find general common language.
Yes. Well, and common language is also, that is also somehow difficult, because even common language, I mean, yes, there is language like in the dictionary or in grammar school, we learned that. But there are technical terms which are localized in different kinds of speech communities.
Yes.
But if you want to have an influence, and if cybernetics wants to, it's, in my opinion, should liberate people from unknown oppressions or discomfort, then one has to come down to the language that people speak.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I was wrong about the timing. We do have half an hour more. I thought we were ended on the hour.
Oh, okay.
Well, we have lots more time.
Oh, that's great.
So I will go to
Great.
Laura's question about the traditional law knowledge as part of this.
Let's see.
Laura, are you there?
No, I
Anyway.
who's articulate?
Tile, who are you calling on?
Laura. Was it 9:42? So it just says Laura. So I guess she's not available anymore. Helena, you were talking about layers of between the agent and the affected.
Yes, I'm concerned about the fact that there are so many layers between the individual who's affected by a policy or a decision and the decision makers. And obviously the decision makers can't have requisite variety, but how is it possible to reintroduce those missing metasystems so that information that's relevant actually can hopefully be decided at lower levels, but if not, actually being filtered in an appropriate way so that when it does get to decision makers, it has more variety in terms of making the decision, well, essentially a better decision, one that does not leave out many potential misuses.
I'm not so sure if I can answer that question. I would be hesitant to say critical cyberneticians are decision makers. I think they should be encouragers. They should enable different kinds of understanding. Yes, there are politicians in Washington. They make decisions, and many people do not have a clue of what the decisions are based on, what the laws are on which they are based. And that's another issue of how to make that available to everyone who either votes on it or has to have an opinion. But I'm more interested in whether someone yields simply automatically to a politician who, by very fact that he is sitting in Washington, has more so-called power than I who voted or didn't vote for that person. So I think, to me, the important part is to help people to understand what they themselves are doing, and decision makers, they are so far removed from ordinary people about which they make decisions that one has to bridge that in some form. I don't know which systems are in between there that you describe. I'm not so sure if I can say very much about that.
I'm not so sure they exist.
Yes. Well, that's, I think ultimately, well, we all speak one language, if you want English, but we speak it in different ways. But there are different vocabularies and different conceptions and different interests. and that makes us all very different. But I think there are certain things that I think critical cybernetics can focus on, namely where it's to see, first of all, that language is just not the way it's written in the dictionary. Language is being used and has effects on other people and effects on yourself, and you identify yourself in conjunction with interacting with others, in conversation with others. And I think in that connection, one ought to improve the life of all those who can participate.
Thank you.
Sukanta had a very specific question about phenomenological psychology. Sukanta, can you speak up?
Well,
the question was, is phenomenological psychology a part of social cybernetics?
I don't know anything about psychology. I think psychology is to me always too limited, if that's what you're asking. Psychology deals with people, and I think if you look at society, the people need to interact with each other. There is a celebration of the internal nature of motivations and cognition by psychologists. There's recently a book that I very much admire that he said the title is, "You can't think by yourself. Thinking is not in your brain. Thinking is a result of being in interactions with other people." So I think psychology is such an artificial reduction of life to very individual kind of problems. Now, I'm not opposing, let's say, therapists who deal with individual issues, but therapists, if you think of, for example, Bateson's critic of individual therapy, thinking that families are really far better background to understand individual problems. That is a different kind of thing. So I'm not interested in psychology as a discipline that is dealing only with individuals. I think that is not very cybernetic also, if you want to do that.
Angus Jenkinson just posted a rather longish question. I think you better speak to it yourself.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I beg your pardon. So thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I do appreciate it very much, Klaus. So my impression is that many aspects of what we call cybernetics today go back a long way, for millennia. In fact, you can look at the teaching of rhetoric, the teaching in various cultic movements and so on, the seven liberal arts in medieval times, development of laws, religious and secular, and so on. So what has been particularly happening in recent times is the development of the Industrial Revolution, technologies and so on. And so now cybernetics, we've become more precise in our understanding of certain principles which are already inherent in nature and in human affairs. But we're now able to couple them to various kinds of technology. So the question that I have is, what is the key insight that we need, and what is the key schooling that as individuals we need in order to be able to counter the problems and achieve the objectives that you are describing in your talk as what's something we ought to be trying to attain?
Well, there's many aspects of that question. Let me first say about the history. Yes, nature is very complicated, but before cybernetics was invented, there were lots of phenomena that were not really understood very well. Heron of Alexandria, 300 BC, cataloged all the technologies that existed, and he found some that were peculiar, that held the flame of an oil lamp constant, that allowed water to use as a constant flow to measure time. And he talked about this as automata and stability, but he didn't have an explanation for it. Now, for millennia, all technologies were actually linear in the sense of extending hammers and levers, expanding the physical ability of human beings to other things. The Industrial Revolution didn't know that much about cybernetics either. There was, in fact, one good example, Watt's steam engine. Watt's steam engine had a regulator, and the regulator held the revolution of an engine constant by variable use. That was very important. It drove the Industrial Revolution, but there was no theory. Wiener, at Wiener's time, when he developed cybernetics, there were already servo mechanisms in industry. There was an institute at MIT of servo mechanisms, but they were not really understood from a cybernetic point of view. So cybernetics started to be understandable in terms of the mathematics that Wiener employed. But I think that was precisely too limiting and created only a more technical understanding and not the kind of language that we are employing. When you ask me about going back to kind of principles, I go back actually to not to rhetoric. That they had other kinds of missions, but there's one theorist, if you want, that is Vico. Vico had the idea, and he was epistemologically opposed to Descartes. Descartes had the idea there's an outside world, and the human mind is really an inferior representation of the existing world. And he said, no, we don't know what is outside of our own actions. And he said, well, that was again 300 years ago. He said, God knows because he made the world. He knows what everything is, but we know only what we do. And he was studying administrations, technology, and including what we say. And he was actually, in my opinion, the beginning of understanding that language is not just stating facts, rather than create facts, do things that are the consequence of speaking. And then comes Wittgenstein, who says, well, you can say whatever you want, but the meaning of it is how it is responded to. So I think to me, the more important principle is not just cybernetics is not everywhere, or has not been everywhere. It's a question of what we do with our own language, what we create, and that is what we can understand.
May I respond and bring my
Yes.
question maybe a bit more to the point, because I think it may not have been clear in the understanding. So one can certainly go back to someone like Aristotle's Entelikeia, which is non-theistic, and it's being at work, staying itself, with how you translate it as an understanding of life. But I'm thinking more, just to give an illustration, I'm thinking more of the art of rhetoric as it was used in, for example, ancient Athens. And it was then spoken to a crowd and it highly influenced. There are famous incidents about, for example, whether or not a particular island or city ought to be punished or not punished based on something that they'd done. Now, what has happened is that the kinds of techniques that were being used in rhetoric then and were learned, and every prince and every king and every nobleman and so on in the Middle Ages and Renaissance learned this, is now being deployed in Facebook, is now being deployed systematically by various kinds of technologies today in the social media. So what I'm thinking about is that there are ancient understandings of life forms. I'm not interested so much in mechanical automata. What I'm interested in is the cybernetic activity that's related to communication. You talked about the importance of conversation, and the manipulation of conversation in order to manipulate behavior through how it's going to be responded to, the context it's going to generate, the emotional responses and the behaviors, and the ability to manipulate that and magnify it over billions of people. What skills do we need, and what skills does the world need, and what is the core insight behind it if we are going to counteract those kinds of forces?
Well, speaking of rhetoric, and I am not really a rhetorician, but all I read about rhetoric is actually a way of linearly affecting other people by clever constructions. There was not much of feedback. there was not much of interaction. It was just
no, it was creating contexts for people.
Yes, the people were basically recipients of clever techniques that could influence them.
They were the cybernetician. They were cybernetically responding. They were responding to the messages. They were responding to what they were.
But only in terms of
changing their behavior.
What the rhetorician had in mind.
Yes, exactly. That was the point.
Yeah, that was the point. But I don't think that is very cybernetic, because that would make a cybernetician to be a dictator of certain type of techniques, or if you want,
but I'm saying that that's
dominating
exactly
or dominating a theory as opposed to another theory. No?
Okay, I don't want to press it, but I'm proposing that it is precisely that capability that is being used at scale, thousands of times, all of the time, and it is the same tools and understanding and techniques that we understand by cybernetics being deployed in those methods. And they're very ancient, but they now have the capability of being more precisely used in conjunction with various technologies.
Well, I agree that they are more used. In fact, Facebook you mentioned, but my point from a cybernetic point of view is that Facebook is just, again, a very good technology, but it doesn't allow the kind of feedback. You cannot hold someone responsible for the messages that he simply passes on. Well, you can say who sent it on, but not what is being said. But I'm a professor in a school of communication. We have a lot of journalists, and they always say we have to report facts. And I say, well, when Trump lies something, this is a fact. He said something, but it doesn't mean that you have to say it, because the consequence of it is different. And I think if one takes only what is said to be communicated, that really ruins the cybernetic aspect, if you want, the circular type of phenomena that are initiated by this. And I think there's a difference.
I have to speak up because Trump does not report facts. He does not. He lies.
But it's the fact that he speaks.
No, well, okay, it's a fact that he speaks, but what he speaks is not based on an intersubjective reality. And therefore, I think he's a liar.
That's all true, but journalists feel obligated to report what he said, and that is a big mistake.
I think that perhaps it would be good to let Raul Espejo speak now. I apologize to everybody that I'm not being very good at this moderating task, because there's a lot of people who have good questions that I've simply not been able to come to in the time available. So apologies if you've been missed, and we'll see what we can do from here. Raul.
Klaus, thank you very much for your presentation. I think you said that what is unique to cybernetics is conversations. Am I correct?
Yes. Whereby one would have to say there are different levels of conversation. Yes.
However, the point I would like you to hear something about is how can you improve the quality of these conversations so that socially they become far more conducive to the well-being or to support the purposes that people may have in society.
Okay. Now, I mean, conversations is, to me, that there's authentic conversation where you respect the other, you are respected, and things happen and you feel really great about it. This is not what really happened, for example, at the Macy Foundation. Now, the Macy Foundation, if you hear a tape, and I heard at some point, well, there was lots of fighting, if you want, but the point was actually people were respected for their views. Different views came together, and there were different responses to it, and out of this multiplicity of views, there came some sort of a consensus, not always united, but that allows more people to have a voice in the nature of what is being constructed, in this case, cybernetics. In my case, certain social phenomena. If one broadens the scope and not just help someone from the outside because one thinks that that person needs help. That's a different. Actually, I can tell you, one of my PhD students, was a Filipino, and she was a social worker, and she complained that many of the developments take place when someone representative of the government comes to a village and says, "What do you need?" and decides for himself. They need a water well. Where is it built? In front of the mayor's house, and that the community had no voice. So she wrote actually a dissertation by introducing a different kind of method to allow people that the person that comes from the outside is not someone who imposes, investigates, but someone who encourages the communicate to discuss and deliberate. That was very much against the traditional social science approach, where one asks questions, one analyzes this in peace, and then comes to conclusions. And she said the community should ask their own questions, evaluate their own questions, and come to their own conclusions. And that is where the responsibility is distributed over other people and not coming from the outside. All I'm saying is that as critical cyberneticians should not just be outsider and criticize. That is negative. To me, cybernetics is something that encourages something that people are not aware of. There is a phrase that I always like, when I read it, someone saying, this is language we did not know we lacked. And I think this is really the important part, that when a critical cybernetician should invent language that is suddenly, they see it was not there, we didn't know that we lacked, now we can really do something with it.
Thank you. Can I add something, Phil? Just my question, you appear to be saying, Klaus, that respect is what is fundamental in the conversations. Mm-hmm. The question that I have in my mind is, what about who is participating in these conversations? How do we know that we have the right contributors to this particular conversation, so that it is not only a matter of respect, but it is a matter of getting out of the expressions that people have, some values, some truth, and in that sense overcome this extraordinary drive towards lies that we see in these days' conversations?
This is a difficult question. If you are concerned with a big population well-being, you can't get everyone involved. One can only say one has to be fair to have a sample of people that could have different views and could come together. And we cannot, all of these social consequences that I described, they were not anticipated, or they could not be easily anticipated, except if one were to invite people that in fact make use of that, then one can indeed come closer to that. This is not a predictive system. It is one that is open to other people's voices. And you're right, one cannot invite everyone. And the question of who is to be invited is a big question. I think one should be, critical cyberneticians should be open to invite a diversity of people in the conversation. The diversity is important, because if you're challenged by whatever, then you start thinking, maybe I have to change my mind.
Hi, this is Jamie Rose. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to join you all from ISSS. There was a flurry of conversation about language. Language is a dual-edged sword. We can use it as a knife to kill, or we can use it as a scalpel to heal. But the sloppy use of the word, and I've been annoyed over the last few years of the term, and especially in the media, using the word fact. If something is a fact, that this is a fact, or if it's a false fact. And that's such a bad application. It is information, is not fact. Fact is considered in the scientific sense to be more of what is reliable, truthful, dependable, and acknowledgeable. So the misuse of the word fact has been very problematic, and the sloppy application of that needs to be changed. We need to be more careful, and it's language is both creative. We need the variability, but we also need to be as exact as possible in those correct situations. And it's just that thought that we need to do that in the sciences as well, in the public venues of social discourse.
Let me respond to that. I have a very different view of that. Fact comes from Latin factum, making. We have a lot of things, factories, artifacts, they're all made, and facts are made too. Scientific facts change constantly over time. I was recently reading a book by Ludwig Fleck, who describes the history of syphilis, starting with the fact that syphilis was caused by astrological configurations, going slowly to whatever we understand now, and it's never finished. The facts are constantly made. In fact, Larry at some point introduced the definition of facts as what's consistent with currently available knowledge. But that's also difficult. Whose knowledge is it? No? So the facts are often used as a rhetorical argument, saying you can't talk about this. It's a fact.
Klaus,
that's a danger.
I understand your point, and it's very accurate. I love etymology. I go back to it myself as a wellspring and source for that. But there is vernacular interpretations and uses which supersede that, become a whole other animal. Fact has become an alternative for the word truth, actual, pertinent, reliable, and when it may not be. And so the choice of a different use of a word to get out of that mold is what the notion I was trying to impress. Loose, casual thinking, what is a fact? It's a fact that the sun came up. It's a fact that I may die sometime, but it's not a fact that I'm going to die right now.
Well, the fact is the sun didn't come up.
Yes.
The fact is the sun did not come up. Based on the
science. True. I understand
right.
that.
So we need to be careful, and I agree with you. We need to be careful with our language and reflect on our language. And I think there's an important distinction.
I think that is precisely the point.
And what is a distinction? A lie, and what is a myth? I mean, all these things are something.
Whose voice is that speaking? I don't see that on my screen.
Lombardi.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
I agree with you. I totally agree.
My pleasure.
I have a question which follows up a bit from this, Klaus. With all due respect for your impressive work all the time, I had a feeling while listening to you that it was a bit a social text, which you give, of course, the reference to critical theory. Critical cybernetics has that in the title. So, and it made me think of two, for one reason or another, it's not Habermas, it is Adorno who I make, because Adorno made an effort to make these F scales. It's not so easy to combine a critical attitude with specialist knowledge. And I think you perhaps too easily say that it is just a matter of civil courage, that one has to go on. There are latent structures in our society, like a political economy, like a division of labor, which make it difficult to bridge those, to make those bridges and then to do still relevant scientific work. Do you see the tension? Let me ask it that way.
Well, first of all, I agree with you. There are lots of different knowledges, different expertise in society, and it's difficult to combine them all. In fact, the whole notion of a singular, simple social system is a myth, because there are so many different ways of looking at it. And that is, I think, the underlying, what I think is underlying your question. And I don't want to make that too simple. But I would say that as soon as we want to change something, as we notice there is some oddity in my case, in the use of technologies, but you can also expand it to other kinds of things, then one has to look into what is the language that makes it so. And I think to me, the issue of power and so has very much to do with the language that we use to grant the power to those people. Actually, I've written papers on power, and I always say, power doesn't exist without someone submitting. And that I see this now, for example, with Trump, and so all of these people that support him. Well, this is these people that support him make it powerful. He is not powerful by himself. So we have to look at the nature of the language that people use to support something and yield and get rid of their own agency and not think about it. But no, about facts, I don't want to get too deeply in it, but there are so many things we take for granted. I mean, I've never seen Trump. He may be a total myth. He may be a holiday fiction, but there are lots of people that have seen him. And so I start trusting them. But it is not so that they have first order understanding of this. So we have to trust a lot of people that have experiences with others. And yes, it's not so simple. But I think all I wanted to say is actually with critical cybernetics, we should be critical on a local level, on particular issues. And lying is one thing, submitting to technology, attributing intelligence to machines that don't have any intelligence, and ruining thereby this is an old thing. I mean, like, artificial intelligence has never been able to create something new, only to extend what we already know and what a computer programmer puts in there. By delegating, saying they are more intelligent as human beings, we stop being intelligent. And so these are the type of things that I think we have to examine.
If you focus on power, it is more or less Hannah Arendt who is in the center, because she predicted patterns like Trump. She really did the job to cross the river.
Could you say that again, sir?
Hannah Arendt, the authoritarian analysis, the analysis of authoritarian personalities, that if you read that, it is almost a description of what Trump is doing. Was doing.
I have somewhat difficulties understanding you. Can someone help me?
What it's about?
I'm sorry. I don't want to confuse you.
Okay.
Could you type the name in the chat, sir?
Okay.
I think Cynthia.
Can I add something?
Anyway, some of us do need to go, including me. So we will leave the room open, and Adler will take over hosting as much as is needed. Thank you, everyone, for your...
Thanks, Pile.
Klaus, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I wanted to ask you something. I will apologize first for my language. I don't know if you'll understand everything what I'll say. So this is about the language and understanding of other people. As we see in the previous case, we didn't understand the man what he was saying. Now, I wanted to ask you if maybe something more about language. It was a great experience. You made auditive and visual informations, So your presentation was packed so that maybe many people could understand that, because if you are talking only, then it's probability that somebody would understand and somebody won't. And then visual information, somebody would understand and don't understand. People are different, and learning styles are different, thinking styles are different. And I agree with you and with the lady who said, I'm also a professor now. And I know what are the troubles when you're trying to present information to others, I was asking myself if I understood right everything. Now, did you mean with uncritical cybernetics, the individuals which form their perceptual world, they create their world and put it as the only possible understanding of the world. Is that the uncritical cybernetics? And critical cybernetics, if I understood right, should be something that is in social interaction exchanged as the knowledge, thoughts, or emotional states, or whatever. And that would be the critical cybernetics, which would enable individuals to make their knowledge wider, to understand universe, to understand living beings, to understand the brain, to understand everything. Then you put the problem of language, which I already exposed, in the exchange of thoughts and everything what people are exchanging among themselves. Was that the point of your presentation?
This is, I mean, I'm not so sure if there's a single clear question, but I think what I got out of it is that, or let's say it differently. I think it is easy to be uncritical in the senses you're excited, like for example, the people in the Macy Foundation conferences, they were excited about the possibilities of describing everything in terms of feedback. And they looked for feedback in biology, in technology, in the history, etc., etc. And they could explain it and understand it, but in their own terms. What I think is important for critical cybernetics is to think there are other views, that there are alternative ways. And that is what is my issue. For example, with Ashby, I mean, he was in some sense a determinist. He celebrated machines and built models that were mechanical. But he had also the idea is that we have to investigate not just systems that exist or can be observed, but also those that are imaginable, that have not been built, that could be. And so by that is where one can look for alternatives. And when I say critical, I would say one has to be critical about whatever one is taking for granted and take maybe a different view, or ask what are the alternatives that one misses when one takes everything for granted. So to me, that is possible only in language. That means alternatives cannot be observed. They can be argued unless you put two things that are different of the same kind in front of you, but you cannot criticize, or criticism cannot be observed, nor can alternatives be observed. In fact, one can go further to what you always talk about, understanding. I'm not so sure what, if I understand your understanding, I'm sure nobody can understand anyone else's understanding. That's a myth. And I say always, when you say in a conversation, say, I understand you, that is not to say that I have a representation of what you are thinking, rather than I'm saying, let's go on to the next topic. We have sufficiently coordinated our interaction. We don't want to continue. Let's do it to another topic. Now that is a different form of understanding. Understanding is actually, to me, a coordination where nobody objects to. So I don't know if that answers your question. Your questions were not so clear, and I'm not so sure if I was too focused on it.
The exchanging thoughts and models, whatever kind of form thoughts take, is essential for the human survival, for example. So not only one can produce, or a branch or cybernetics can produce such a perceptual construct that would be acceptable for everyone. So if I understand right, it's important that we are communicating and exchanging our thoughts, exchanging our theories, exchanging everything, so that we make our perceptual world bigger or wider and more acceptable for everything what is outside.
That's right.
Or inside.
That's
whatever.
Right. But I think this comes with exposure with other people that think differently, have different expertise, bring different views into conversation, and that cannot be done, let's say, by single detached observers who always have their own cognition and describe their observation the way they think is correct.
Yes, maybe we can put here also the question about if somebody thinks that he is correct, and he tries to express his correct view with terrorism, killing other people, conflicts, and so on. This is a bad thing of the conversation or the exchange of thoughts or anything else, but it is the necessary part of the life on Earth, I think.
Well, I would say everyone lives in his own universe. The question is, are they open to alternatives? Yes. And I think when people are very ideologically entrapped, I have had so many conversations with people that have one view only that explains everything, and then it's very difficult to communicate with them. But actually, I say always, it's not hopeless, because the very fact that one can talk maybe about other things opens the door to change their mind.
I agree with you. It was a fine conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Klaus, while I wait for someone to raise their hand, I would like to ask if you could elaborate the idea of we need to get a common understanding of things. And you talked about mathematics, which is very precise, and language as leaves a lot of things open, which is good for generative ideas. How do we balance the, let's say, useful conversation, or let me put it another way, does your proposal of critical cybernetics includes mathematics in some way, or some representation that it's somehow specific that we can kind of point to? Like if you're drawing together on a whiteboard, we can point to something and might help us to discuss.
I mean, if I understand your question correctly, I would say you're asking what is the role of mathematics in that thing. Is that correct?
Yeah? Or the role of mathematics or an alternative. Like if we are discussing with a whiteboard, we have something to point to that helps us to make sense of our discussion. And this is an alternative to mathematics in a way.
Yeah, let's see, mathematics is peculiar because there's usually only one solution, one result, or a set of results, but it is very deterministic. That means the observer adopts a system of representation. It's not even too clear what it represents, but then one operates within the language of mathematics. And that is not very conducive to alternative views. Now, I think that is almost, I would say, the opposite of what conversation is like, namely that you change your mind, that you change the equations if you want, and do something very different. And I think mathematics, mathematical description, that is a criticism actually. What I admire Margaret Mead, who in this 1967 address, and I hope that you read it again. I read it several times because when I was there, I was more or less a student. I really didn't understand the implications of it. She could not criticize Norbert Wiener, but Norbert Wiener was actually the mathematician who defined cybernetics basically as a discipline of mathematics. And she could not criticize him, but he gave all kinds of other examples. But mathematics, and Wiener in fact said also, social sciences are not amenable to cybernetics, mainly because they are too diffuse, too complicated, and there are too many data. We cannot really look at the whole history of society in order to make predictions. So he had a negative attitude, rightly so, because he was a mathematician. And mathematicians have their own narrow view of what is kind of deterministic. And that's the reason why I started actually saying that the traditional notion of cybernetics is to have an idea of maybe feedback, to find a mathematical explanation, then to translate that in an algorithm, and then make the machine and let it go. And that is the history of that I predicted, or I showed you And the whole notion of, for example, that cybernetics works to ultimately towards automata, that is implied in the nature, the mathematical nature of systems, of cybernetics a la Wiener, to have simple feedback where one delegates. It's just a small part that one doesn't want to deal with, to delegate more and more, and in the end have a machine that does everything automatically, and we have to all use it. That is the result of a mathematical type of approach, and I would say that ignores completely the natural language that we use in conversations. Mathematics is not, it's a language that doesn't have a place for other kinds of languages, ordinary languages.
Makes sense. There was a comment from James Bryant on similar topic about this common understanding. Do you want to unmute and follow up that comment?
Yes, by all means. No, I mean, I dropped a comment in that said basically common understanding is just selective approximation, and we agree on a mutual selective approximation, i.e. none of us knows exactly what is going, what we make a representation in our head of a table, and you make a representation of a table, and we selectively agree that whatever it is a table or a mechanism, and therefore you don't know what's going on in my head and I don't know what's going on in your head, but the external representation is what we can agree on. It's a big Venn diagram of agreement.
But I think when you talk about approximation, then you assume there is something to be approximated. I don't think that is the case.
Oh.
When you say that we agree that this is a table, then we agree, actually coordinate on something. Then we talk about it, this is a table. But it doesn't mean that we see it the same way.
No, exactly, and it goes beyond the mathematical definition of what a table is.
Right.
Because we're dealing with concepts that we can commonly agree without knowing specifically what I think a table is or what you think one is. So we have this common area of understanding without having to define it. But
you see, I don't think we have a common area of understanding. Understanding to me is let's continue. We are fine with our coordination to call it a table, and that's all we want to know. Or we want to use putting things on the table, and for someone it's something different than for me. But the point is, we don't understand each other. We say we understand, and that means let's continue. It's boring to dwell on further.
I'm in agreement with you. We have a moment of common acceptance.
Yes, common acceptance. That is a good substitute. But it's not an approximation, because that's the myth, the representational notion of language, that we have a representation in our mind of what it really is, and when we understand, we must have the same image, and that is not it. This is Gordon Pask has this notion of sharing. We don't share that way.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Is there any other further comment, questions? Otherwise, then, Larry, please.
Klaus, just a question about the use of the word deterministic. For me, that's just what science does, is it tries to find deterministic explanations of things. And the alternative endeavor would be called the arts. And they both have value. And so I'm wondering, when you seem to be reluctant to advocate for deterministic explanations.
So I mean, Ashby? And Ashby was someone who said, we have to translate everything in machine terms, and only once we have it so fixed that we can predict. That's fine, but that is a very limited form of understanding if you want mainly physical systems. And most scientists are, in fact, trying to predict, finding determinisms that allow us to predict. But prediction is coming from the outside, from someone who wants to know how something moves on, but it assumes that it continues the same trajectory as in the past. Prediction means that it continues the same pattern. But conversations are totally different. Conversations are not predictable. No conversation repeats itself. Conversation creates always new things. It's same with evolution. Actually, Gregory Bateson at some point, he saw actually in Ashby at the other side. He said, Ashby is actually a theorist of evolution. And he said, Ashby's cybernetics explains what cannot happen, but leaves open what could happen. And so there is also something to that. So Ashby was actually a multiple, had many faces. But the point is actually a conversation is inherently open to differences. And I think this is what I cherish by being confronted with different ideas that change my mind and get me, look me forward. And that is different from prediction. And prediction is the strategy of traditional scientists that put themselves outside the system that they are concerned with and look only for patterns that are historically continuing and not changing.
I agree. I wonder though what it says about the viability of social science as a science.
Well, it depends on what kind of social science you look into. If you look into sociology, I mean, this is also interesting. Sociology has made many transitions. And for example, Tucker Parsons, he had the idea of an actor. An actor conforms to the rules of an organization and finds himself acting in support of a system. But we know now this is a very reactionary kind of sociology that supports only existing structures. If you want the elites, it doesn't support or explains revolutions or things that change. So I think a discipline that, like in the social sciences, that only predicts is inherently unable to cope with radical changes. And to me, I think language is the medium in which alternatives can be considered, in which different views can be challenging each other. And that's the reason why I think I celebrate conversation, and you too. I mean, that's what we have in common, that it's conversations to me, the core of evolution on a conceptual level and on the theoretical level, and ultimately also on a practical level, because in conversations, things can happen. And I have a history in design, and I have been also in many conversations with designers and managers and engineers and so, and often we find things that nobody was thinking of by himself and create something entirely new that nobody could have thought by himself. So, and nobody could own also, because it was the result of the kind of conversation that we had. So I think to me that is critical in critical cybernetics, because I think critical cybernetics has to do with alternatives, the alternatives that any science that deals only with predictions can never capture.
Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus, very, very much, and as well the audience. But Klaus, this has been 2 hours, very rich, very diverse. As always, thank you so much. As someone mentioned on the chat, thank you for humanizing a lot of parts in this discussion, while people try to be very deterministic. So thanks for bringing this human aspect to these topics.
Well, thank you for, I think, the questions, and I hope some people get away from using mathematics in a predictive way and celebrating technology as being superior of human beings. We have to recognize our own humanity, and being active is important, and delegating our activity to others, things that we don't understand, I think is a danger.